Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Millennial Moron podcast. I'm pleased to announce that due to your incessant nagging in the comments, I finally managed to secure an interview with Richard Coffin, a.k.a. the Plain Bagel, a well-known finance YouTuber from Canada, although he covers issues that affect markets all over the world. I actually got my first boost on YouTube when he mentioned my work as a source he used for his video on Canada's housing crisis, which got me to start taking YouTube and the analytical videos more seriously. So in a way, he's like my social media uncle or something. Anyway, we sat down to talk about the election and some of the financial issues facing Canadians in the coming years, so without further ado, please enjoy the interview. Hello, Richard. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'll call you MM. I feel like calling you Millennial Moron is a bit rude.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I usually go by Dr. Moron.
There we go.
So we're going to
Okay,
be,
of course, yeah.
yeah, we're going to be talking about some stuff related to the election and what kind of impacts different policies might have on people's personal finances and, sort of the domestic and international economy. So jumping right into it, the Liberals are proposing a 1% tax cut to the lowest income tax bracket, which would save people about $400 a year, while the Conservatives are pitching a 2.25% cut to that bracket, which would be about $900 a year, assuming you're making about $57,000 or more. Do you think that'll have a meaningful impact on people's lives compared to the budgetary impact, especially considering that we're already in a deficit?
I mean, no, like it's tough to say. For lower income people, obviously, any amount of money helps quite a bit. But in terms of tax cuts, it's really not a meaningful tax cut, even though it might be presented as such, compared to what we've seen in the past at times. And in terms of the budgetary impact, that's kind of a consideration with all of this, especially, and we see it every election cycle in terms of promises versus sources of revenue. It's very unpopular to announce new sources of revenue, and we might talk about it, but as well, both parties both parties being Liberal and Conservative, are talking about abandoning the capital gains tax increase. So we're kind of having this other source of revenue cut off as well, or at least previously proposed source of revenue that was going to cover other programs. So that's now changing. So, will it have an impact? Sure. And, for someone in a low income tax bracket, it might be a meaningful impact. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's a material tax cut that we're seeing here.
Right. Now, something I found really interesting is that the Green Party is proposing to increase the basic personal amount to $40,000, which would be a pretty big tax cut. That would be
Quite a
about
bit, yeah.
that would be $3,600 a year, right? And obviously that would have to be counterbalanced by tax increases elsewhere if they wanted it to be anywhere near revenue neutral. But the interesting thing about that to me is that when you raise the basic personal amount, you also give couples access to the spousal allowance. So one partner can claim the other's if the other's income is less than the basic personal amount. So bumping the limit up to 40,000 might actually go a long way towards helping younger families with kids and, maybe even making single income households more viable again.
Yeah, it's interesting in some more. I'm going to forget the country, but there are countries where you actually get a tax break when you have children, and so it'd be interesting in a country. On the one hand, Canada has no issue with population growth, obviously, but on the other hand, that's primarily driven by immigration, and without immigration, we actually have a declining population. So it depends on what the incentive there is, like whether there's a desire to incentivize birth rates to increase. Canada doesn't inherently have a population growth problem, like I said. But in terms of whether there be a tremendous benefit there, yes. But again, to your point, that tremendous benefit has to be made up somewhere else to be budgetary neutral. And that's quite a bit of an increase to say you don't pay taxes up until, that $40,000 to $50,000 mark. It's quite a big jump. People would love that, but then that has to be offset somewhere else. And I'm sure with the Green Party, we would see that kind of in the higher tax brackets. I think the effective, at least in Ontario, the effective total highest tax bracket is around 52%, if I'm not mistaken. So it would be likely there we see kind of a further increase, or maybe a billionaire's tax for all we know. But yeah, I mean, interesting proposal nonetheless.
Yeah, I think some of what they were talking about was to increase the corporate tax rate instead, which, also has its own knock-on effects.
Yeah, on with corporate tax, the tough thing is, and this was actually a big criticism of the capital gains tax increase, was there was no exception to the capital gains increase for corporations. And kind of the one thing Canada has going for its tax system is it offsets somewhat the personal tax increases the high tax rates on the personal side with relatively lower rates on the corporate side. Now, if you're like a entrepreneur or someone who's incorporated, if you pay money into your corporation and then take that money out immediately, it roughly nets to the same total tax that you pay otherwise. But the criticism with the capital gains tax is that corporations, even though it might sound great, yeah, let's tax the corporations and make it the money there. When that money is received by the person anyway, then it's going through that, it's kind of being double taxed. So if you increase one, you're still having the impact on the personal side. And B, in Canada, corporations are used primarily by a lot of contractors and doctors as a savings account. So a lot of the pushback with the initial capital gains hike was this vehicle, corporations, was almost presented to doctors in Canada as an incentive to put their savings in this corporation as, again, without getting too technical, it helps you delay your tax, which gives you a benefit over time. The longer you allow it to compound without taxes, the net benefit you see by delaying taxes. And the capital gains greatly decrease that benefit for doctors, for a country that's desperate for doctors at the moment. I think if you go to hike taxes on the corporate side, you have to leave room or consider the individuals who work through corporations. Corporations might sound like massive conglomerates that, obviously make more money than they know what to do with, but it also encompasses those individuals who the corporation is really just a representation of the work they do and kind of a vehicle for that. So you do have to be cautious with that and consider the cracks for those kind of people.
Yeah, that was a big thing when I was reading about it was, a lot of people online on Twitter or whatever were very concerned about, they're going to hike capital gains taxes on me, even though they may have never declared a taxable capital gain in their lives. But the medical professional personal corporations is a big issue. And I think if I recall correctly, they actually used the ability of medical professionals to use this tax structure as a way to negotiate lower rates to be paid by the government for different services, right? So,
Well, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, it is possible to increase the capital gains tax rate, but you would have to renegotiate that rate sheet.
Yeah, and that was kind of, a lot of people at the time, it was kind of characterized as a betrayal for that exact reason. Like it was sort of used as a saving grace, I guess, for this change in rates and the like, to say, hey, we're gonna hit you here, but give you a benefit here to offset that. And again, for a country, A, with massive population growth, but B, with a doctor shortage, especially family doctors, it was sort of seen as a misstep. And maybe that's why we're seeing both parties, outside of being unpopular, maybe that's why we're seeing both parties kind of move away from that.
Mm. Now, speaking of capital gains, the Conservatives have proposed a capital gains deferral if you reinvest the money back into Canada. Some people have been comparing this to a 1031 exchange in the States, but it's kind of different because there's not the same requirements of a like-kind asset. It just has to be like country, essentially. And one of the reasons they put behind this idea is that there's a lot of people sitting on assets like real estate that they don't want to sell because of the tax implications, so it's locking up a lot of money that could be used for other investments. And, personally, I think over the last 25 years or so, a huge amount of investment in our economy is focused on real estate, which is an unproductive asset, essentially, instead of productive assets like, say, machinery and intellectual property. But do you think a capital gains deferral for individuals will actually have that intended effect of spurring more productive investment?
I think will it have the effect? Yes. It's an interesting policy. I think it's a unique one. And I think for a country, because Canada also has a foreign direct investment problem as well, where the country doesn't attract a lot of capital outside of real estate from other countries. You look at our stock market, it's not the most attractive stock market internationally. But so it's an interesting policy. Will it have that net impact? It could. It's difficult to say, however, because ultimately, what drives, like if you're talking about stock performance, for example, and getting people to invest in stocks, ultimately what's going to drive the attractiveness of stocks is the fundamental growth of the companies. And the TSX has lagged like the S&P 500 in terms of the fundamental growth of earnings over time. Now, the S&P 500 has also seen like a massive jump in its valuation gap, which Canada doesn't have. So there's kind of a trade-off there that investors have to consider. But it's tough to say whether it will, because I think real estate has a lot of momentum for it. There's your argument around it's income generating because of renting and stuff. And, with real estate versus stocks, a big chunk of it is cultural as well, almost, where people don't like stocks at times because they don't understand the businesses. They don't know how to analyze a company. But real estate's very tangible. It's very easy to understand. There's this view that, the population keeps growing. We have a limited amount of land. And, you can easily see the expenses, the income and stuff. So I don't know if it'll be enough to shift kind of investor preferences, but it's one move towards that. Not a policy expert, so I couldn't give you a determination about whether it's a good policy or a bad policy, but it's interesting. And I think, at least it moves towards the idea that if we do have a lot of money kept up in real estate because of, say, tax implications, it would be interesting to see if we do see that move into things like stocks and the like.
Yeah, and I guess there would be an impact of, say, a deemed disposition if a parent wants to hand a property down to their children or something, and they could offset those capital gains with an investment in a retirement portfolio.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point too, actually, in terms of, transferring assets and the like. It could certainly encourage that. The question is, will it lead to money, say, leaving the family effectively? Like, will we see, or real estate leaving the family, sorry, like seeing real estate enter the market and, say, an increase in supply versus people just sitting on properties? I'm not sure. And it's tough to say. I do think, like, we've seen municipalities impose their vacancy taxes here in Ottawa. I'm not sure what it would be like over kind of Western yonder, but we have our vacancy tax here in Ottawa. I think that helps to an extent, but there's still obviously the issue of landlords and kind of the growing investment in properties and that view of properties as an investment versus properties as a necessity.
Yeah, they have been doing that in the Okanagan Valley in BC as well. Like a lot of places that had a large number of short-term rentals, because there are people who would have a vacation property, for example,
Right. Yeah.
that they would Airbnb the rest of the year. And now some of those are being pushed on to the long-term rental market because of this vacancy tax. But we've also seen places like Kelowna putting in a lot of efforts to get new purpose-built rentals built. So it's hard to isolate the effect.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. It's. I mean, that's the tough thing with housing in general is not just in terms of the all of the factors that play a role with real estate demand, but one thing to consider even with this election is so much of the we talk a lot about increasing supply and building more affordable homes, but a lot of the roadblocks for development and the like are actually set at the provincial or the municipal level. Mm-hmm. So kind of a consideration with the federal election. There are promises being made around housing, and those are important to consider. But there's not really anything the federal government can do to completely address the housing issue. There is stuff at the municipal and the provincial levels that need to be worked on as well. And a lot of the federal government's role is going to have to fall on getting buy-in from provinces to address these issues and municipalities. And, I'm sure you have notes on it that we'll touch on as well. But part of both conservative and liberals are trying to incentivize municipalities to effectively give developers more leeway with developing affordable properties. So there is kind of that awareness, but at the end of the day, like I said, it does the buck ultimately falls on the municipalities and the provinces to help on those issues.
Yeah, that is something I try to talk about a lot when I'm talking about housing policy, is that you need all three levels of government pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
Right. We've got this federal election, and this is what everybody focuses on right now. And they're promising to, get X number of houses built by 2030.
Yeah.
And a lot of their policies are focused around new purpose-built rental units, which I think is a good idea. I think that's something that we've been lacking in new supply of in Canada for quite a long time. But if you look at, for example, say Toronto, you can see data from Sean Hildebrand from Urbanation that's showing that the average time from application to completion of a new purpose-built rental unit is 100 months.
Right.
So almost 8.5 years. So that puts us past 2030 already, even before we're going to see the first bits of housing come online, unless we do something about the extremely long timelines involved at the municipal level.
Yeah. And again, that's where those incentives come into place. I believe the Conservatives are looking to tie federal funding to development times and things of that sort. And Liberals have something similar. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but they do have proposals in addressing that. But, in terms of what ultimately needs to get done to get those steps in place. Again, you talk about Toronto. Toronto has pretty interesting zoning requirements that really restrict the level of sort of mid-rise properties that can be throughout the city. There's kind of these residential blocks that are all single-family home properties, which is great. And, I understand, most people desire single home property versus like a tiny condo. But for Toronto, it's kind of mind-boggling for this massive city with this massive population, just the fields of single-family properties that you see at times.
Yeah, there was a group called School of Cities that released these maps for a few of our major cities that they called the Yellow Belt, which was
Oh yeah.
R1 zoning. So, and
Yeah.
this huge swaths of cities, even in, the areas fairly close to the urban core where you cannot build anything other than a single family home. And that process of, rezoning, permitting, public hearings,
Yeah.
it eats up a lot of time. And because of that, it also creates a lot of risk, right? There's regulatory risk of whether or not you're going to be able to build the thing that you need to build.
Mm.
And then there's carrying costs the whole time. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing mainly high-end luxury units being built is because the process is so arduous that that's the only way you can actually turn a profit or break even.
Well, that's it. You think of the profit trade-off for the developer. It's just more profitable to make a luxury property. And I don't know what the breakdown is. I know in the United States, because, we see similar trends there. I believe it went from a quarter of homes built were, or maybe it was 20%, 21% of homes built were affordable 2 decades ago versus 7% now. And I think we've seen a similar trend in Canada, in terms of the percentage of homes that are built. And there are requirements. I believe there's a requirement in terms of with new developments, a certain percentage have to be affordable in certain areas. But it, to your point, it's the incentive isn't there to build affordable properties, because if you're going to spend, to your point, 10 years building a property, you might as well get the most bang for your buck in doing so, especially because this whole time you have capital that's idle and not growing in value or used for another purpose. So, that is kind of it seems like the biggest area that Canada could win is by addressing those kind of lag times and the like, on all fronts. And what's interesting is I know under Trudeau, before kind of the recent resignation, there's this idea of the wartime catalog of homes, which was this idea of having properties that were pre-approved effectively, or at least it would speed up the building process by having this catalog of properties that had a simpler process for getting approved. I don't know if that's actually gone through or not, but this time around, what's interesting
it has. It's been released.
Okay, so we've seen that release. So I'm not sure how successful that's been, what the track record's been of that. But what's
Still
interesting
early days.
Still very early days,
Yeah.
yeah. And we'll see 10 years from now if if the properties got developed. But what's interesting is this time around we're seeing a lot of focus and discussion of prefabricated or manufactured homes, effectively meaning homes that are essentially built in a factory and then brought to the location that they're installed at. So it's an interesting strategy, and we'll have to see if it works, but different anyway, all to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, it's all things that have been successfully implemented elsewhere, and it's going to depend on whether or not we can get it together to have the same success. I mean, you can say the same thing about public housing, right? It's a very touchy subject here, I think, and what we've tried to do is push the responsibility onto the private sector by saying you need to build X percent of affordable housing, instead of the government providing affordable housing as a service that we spend money on. But if you don't create the regulatory environment for private companies to be able to do that at a profit, then they're going to do nothing. I think it was Brad Bradford, a city councilor in Toronto, who put it pretty well when he said 30% of zero is zero.
Yeah. I read that quote. Well, that's exactly it. It's not conducive, right? Is kind of the issue. It's not conducive to building properties. And what's interesting is, it's not conducive towards building affordable properties is I think an important distinction, because Canada housing starts per capita, which is a very rough measure, is I believe roughly double what it is in the US. Canada's percentage of population that works in construction is around 7 to 8% versus around 4% in the United States. So we have the workforce, we have the likes for development, but it's not conducive towards affordable housing again, because again, with how long it takes to build, you have these issues of well, why not take the profit and make a luxury condo versus an affordable housing project.
Yeah. Now, I do want to get into housing, but there is one thing I want to circle back to on stocks finance
Sure.
before we move on. But the conservatives, in addition to this capital gains deferral, they're pitching a $5,000 increase to the annual TFSA contribution limit, but it's specific to Canadian investments. So do you think that'll actually spur a meaningful increase in Canadian capital available for retail investors?
It's tough to say because, I don't think most of the people who have, say, maxed out their TFSA where that would be meaningful, I don't know if it's tough to say. I think there's already incentives in place for most TFSA investments to be in Canadian stocks. So just an example, and this might not be very aware, people might not be very aware of this, but if you hold, say, a US dividend paying stock in a TFSA, you actually pay taxes on that. The dividend is not tax exempt if it's a U.S. stock within a Canadian TFSA, because we don't have a treaty with the U.S. for the tax-free savings account. So I do already think that a lot of tax-free savings accounts are, at least because of that one limitation, have a bias towards Canadian stocks. There are also other incentives for investing in Canada. Again, like I highlighted earlier, I think Canada has a foreign direct investment issue where it has difficulty attracting foreign investment. So again, I wouldn't have the expertise to highlight whether a $5,000 increase for Canadian stocks would, say, move the needle on investment in Canadian industries. It might, and I think there's no, it benefits individuals, and I think it's smart to have those incentives in place. I don't know if it's going to be enough to move the needle. If again the $5,000 for everyday Canadians is going to accumulate to meaningful investment.
Yeah, I looked up some of the figures beforehand, and roughly half of people who are eligible to hold a TFSA actually hold one. And of those people, it's a little less than 9% of people who have a TFSA that are maxing it out on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And presumably the number of people who have an extra $5,000 a year kicking around is even lower, right? But it does work out
Sure.
to about 1.5 million people maxing out their TFSAs. So if each of those people put in an extra 5,000, that'll be about $7.5 billion. Probably would be less than that, maybe like 5 billion a year. But I mean, the thing to me is I'm one of those people who maxes out the TFSA every year, and I have a passive, globally diversified index investing strategy that I use, right?
Right.
And, I'm not a super high net worth individual or anything, but even with this passive strategy that I'm using, I have like $40,000 or $50,000 in Canadian investments already, right?
Yeah.
So if I get this extra TFSA room, am I actually going to invest more money in Canada, like an additional 5,000 into Canada, or am I just going to reallocate my Canadian assets into this new space that's opened up for me and use the other unrestricted space for whatever I want?
Yeah, that's a good point, in terms of the unintended consequence of what if people just reshuffle their portfolio. Like most people already have, exactly to your point, most people already have a home bias. Like most Canadians probably already invest, let's say you have $80,000 of space, already invest roughly, 8% of their portfolio or more, likely more, into their TFSA. So yeah, to your point, it's just, what if you just allocate that $5,000 to that and then just, maybe go and buy some more in tech stocks in the US or whatever people are interested, or crypto for all we know. So it's a good point in terms of unintended consequences. And, it's even something in my work, the company I work for has high net worth clients, and the people with the most money, they tend to prioritize RSP room building versus TFSA room building. There's just that tangible benefit of the tax deferral, especially when they're high income earners, to take that tax credit, the tax deferral and the repayment of the taxes they paid, and see that up front and have that tax deferral strategy. So that's kind of another issue as well is, the people with the most money who might have the extra money, $5,000, they tend to prioritize RSP space. And I don't know if, again, TFSA space is going to make them switch if they aren't even maxing out on the RSP side.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that there's a public perception, probably because of the parties that it's associated with, that, the TFSA investing is for rich people who have tons of money, and RRSPs are for regular working people who want to build up a retirement fund. But really, when you look at it, your TFSA, you're putting in after-tax money. So it's more advantageous to people on a lower income. The RRSP, you get that tax deferral based on your top marginal rate. So it's more advantageous to people making a lot of money. And you get more RRSP room the higher your income is.
Yeah.
Whereas the
Yeah.
TFSA,
18% of your income. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
18% of your income. And, if you don't earn a bunch of money that year, you don't get that contribution room later. You still have to hit whatever the top income is to get that allowance. Whereas TFSA, you kind of get the same amount every year, whether you can use it that year or not. You might use some this year. You might have a windfall later on in your life and be able to max it out. Uh, so to me, I think the TFSA is more advantageous for lower and middle income people.
yeah. And, I don't give financial advice online, but the one thing that a lot of people highlight is the TFSA is usually one of the better starting points for a beginner investor because the lower consequences that come of, say, pulling the money back out.
Yeah.
So if you're just starting, if you have to choose between RRSP, you have to have the space in the RRSP. So if you're literally just starting from square one, you don't have a year of income yet, you won't be able to contribute to an RSP. But on top of that, if you're just starting off and you're, say, building a rainy day fund or whatever, the TFSA is better for that purpose than an RRSP because you can access the money easier. There's no tax consequence or penalty, and you get the contribution space back the next year. So if you withdraw $10,000, you can't. If you're already maxed out for the current year, you can't put that back in, but you can in the next year. So next year it'll reset and say, okay, you pulled out 10,000 last year, you can put that $10,000 back. Whereas the RSP, once you pull money out, it's A, tax, so now you have a tax burden that comes with that, and B, you lose that space. You can't then put it back unless it's part of like the home buyer's plan, the education plan, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I've been in that exact situation too. I 1,000 years ago in my early 20s, I put some extra money that I was making to a TFSA, and I was like, okay, if I can keep this in here long term, it'll be great and it'll grow. And if I need it, I can pull it back out
Yeah.
with fairly low consequences. And then later on, when I was making no money and I needed that money to buy, food and rent and stuff, I got it into my TFSA and it was
Yeah.
fine. I got the contribution room back, and now I'm back to being maxed out again.
Yeah, and it's surprising how many, like, for example, at my company, it's surprising how many clients we'll get who are wealthy individuals who have no TFSA. Like, they only have an RRSP. And that could be, there's a lot of misconception about the TFSA, even for wealthier individuals, in terms of, the name savings account sort of misleads people. So many people have money in TFSA that's like just sitting in cash or in kind of a low interest savings account of some sort. So that's kind of a marketing problem, realistically. But like to your point, it is, and kind of tying it back to the policy, the TFSA is, I don't know if I'd say it's geared towards kind of beginner or lower income individuals, but certainly it's a more popular vehicle for that area. Whereas the RSP is a more popular vehicle for higher income individuals because you see that immediate tax benefit. If you're a high tax individual, you get more of a benefit kind of immediately from doing that. And it's more tangible. And so, you get a $10,000 check back this year effectively when you contribute, if you make a big enough contribution. And it is an interesting kind of thing you see.
Yeah, I think if they just changed one letter in the acronym and made it a TFIA instead of a TFSA.
Yeah, well,
people would understand it a lot better.
Yeah,
like online all the time when people recommend putting money into a TFSA, I see people saying, well, the rates on TFSAs from the banks are really bad. That's not a rate on a TFSA. A TFSA is just a wrapper that includes a different account. So it's not a high interest savings account. It's whatever you want it to be.
That's right.
Yeah. So moving on to housing, the Liberals have proposed creating an organization called Build Canada Homes, which honestly seems like a lot like the original mandate of the CMHC, but whatever. So the main proposal they have is to provide $25 billion in financing for new housing construction. And obviously that'll help de-risk some of those projects on the front end in terms of carrying costs. But do you think that's enough with all the other uncertainty going on in the market right now?
I mean, it's again, tough to say. I think so. Like the goal of this institution as well is bringing that amount. We're at, I believe it's $250,000 property home starts. The goal is to bring it up to 500,000. Will that have an impact? Of course. Like to double the amount of homes being built would be meaningful. The issue is like achieving that, like whether it's able to achieve that. The other issue is, again, we still have immigration of around 500,000 for permanent residents. I think 300,000 for temporary, if I'm not mistaken. So students and the like. those are the current numbers that have been brought down from where they were. I think 2024 there was just shy of 1 million immigrants into Canada. So when you still have this population growth, it's still outpacing the home development that does play a role as well. And what matters is, the type of immigration we're seeing. If it's students, that has more pressure because they have to have housing and might not, that can have its pressures as well, versus if they, there have been plans to bring in construction workers and the like to help solve the issue. But it's tough to say, will it ultimately benefit? I think it will help the situation. I couldn't tell you if it's enough, not a development expert, I guess.
Yeah. Although interestingly, some of the changes that they've made to the non-permanent resident programs, like DFWs, IMP, foreign students, they recently retooled some of the visa requirements and what you get for points on your immigration score for different things. And it's been having a real effect. Last quarter was the first quarter we've seen in a long time where there was a net outflow of non-permanent residents.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, the last few years have been huge, as you said,
Yeah.
like very, very quick population growth, mainly temporary visa holders. And there are, pathways to PR from there. So when they say net outflow of non-permanent residents, some of it may be people flowing into the PR stream rather than necessarily leaving the country. But then you have a better idea of what your population growth level is going to be, because we've had these completely unrestricted programs for a long time where we've just not really had a target and have kind of assumed that it'll be sustainable because they're not here forever. But that's, you're at that point, you're kind of messing with people's lives a little bit.
Yeah. And, we still see those like student populations at times purchasing properties and things like that. Like that was kind of one big pressure was, even if it's a temporary resident, obviously they still need to stay somewhere. And while you would assume it becomes rental demand, you still see situations of people trying to buy properties. And, again, when it comes to policy, I don't know what the solution to that is, but we've seen places try different things in terms of banning foreign purchasing of properties and the like. But it's so interesting to hear. I hadn't seen about the temporary decline, but again, makes sense. So we've definitely seen the Liberal Party pivot on that very heavily, where kind of even during Trudeau, kind of went from it's not really an issue to kind of a full almost 180 in terms of imposing caps on how many people can come into the country.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to the housing for new construction, do you think, providing $25 billion in financing, there's not many details yet, but do you think it's really meaningfully different from what they were doing earlier by doubling the size of Canada mortgage bond issuance and then having the government buy half of it, kind of just injecting $30 billion of liquidity into the lending market?
I mean, it can't, right? Like, I think the goal is going to be, or the effect is going to be like a decline in mortgage rates for certain buyers if we see more liquidity injected. Again, it's tough. It's tough to know whether that will be enough to or what the net impact will be. I think with, for example, CMHC, there's kind of this goal of boosting mortgages on kind of the lower income end. And with this program, like in terms of the financing, and there's even the $1 billion equity financing for, again, the prefabricated home building. So it's tough to say what the net impact will be because they're kind of siloed in a way to certain areas or to benefit certain areas. But good, tough, sorry to give a non-answer, but good question. Will it be the I don't want to comment on something that I can't give a good answer to, but
it's true. It really is a wait and see. It's going to depend also on whether people are going to bite on the opportunity, right? We saw very much the same thing with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which for many years was kind of a vaporware thing. It didn't really produce any of the large projects they were kind of claiming it would. But interestingly, in the last couple of years, it's been taken over by a new person who has redirected it towards smaller projects that meet immediate needs of individual communities, and they've started actually getting a lot more projects done. So I think it's a matter not just of having the right policy in place, but also having the right key people managing it and figuring out where you can best apply it and making those connections.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of always the issue with government policy and throwing money at stuff doesn't always solve the solution. It has to be smartly directed at the people who need the money, right? So if people don't have the appetite for example, prefabricated homes, I couldn't tell you what the demand trends for prefabricated homes are. I know in the U.S. the prefabricated homes have become kind of a growing market share. I don't know if they've been a growing market share in Canada, or again if city zoning would allow for for the implementation of prefabricated homes in certain areas. But it's interesting nonetheless in terms of you know, or the consideration is always, is this policy going to be used? Do we have the incentives in place and the desire from the private parties to carry out the action that this policy is trying to achieve? And if not, the money kind of can go nowhere and can cause more frictions or inefficiencies than it benefits. So, it's tough to say.
Yeah. So another proposal is getting rid of the GST on new home sales in certain circumstances, depending on the party. And it seems to me like this is a way to try and move some of the new home inventory that's been building up, because there's a lot of new construction that hasn't actually been absorbed by the market right now, especially in markets like Toronto and Vancouver that have seen, let's say, some tricky issues in their condo markets.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'm kind of wondering if this is actually going to provide that much help for, younger people or first-time home buyers, right? Like the Liberals are focusing on, they're going to eliminate the GST on new homes up to $1 million for first-time buyers. But how many first-time buyers are actually dropping $1 million on a new build home?
Yeah. Well, that, like, there is a benefit because GST, it's 5%, if I'm not mistaken. And so, you take 5% of a $500,000 property, that's still thousands of dollars that helps the new first time home buyer. But in terms of, first of all, the threshold's pretty high. I think Liberals is $1 million and Conservatives is 1.3 million in terms of the price that the home can be purchased for this benefit. It's, again, the problem with this and similar to when we had 30-year mortgages introduced is it adds to the demand side without adding to the supply side. Like, the issue is really not, and it's not to say that it's a bad policy, because, I think what we've seen from the parties is trying to sort of make the demand more bottom heavy in the sense of incentives so that the lower income individuals have some advantages or some ways to push back against higher income buyers, which, that makes sense to an extent. But ultimately, when we have a supply issue where we're having, again, more population growth than we have supply, increasing the demand or increasing incentives to buying doesn't inherently sort of crowd out the high income buyers that are also still a problem in the market as well. So, is it beneficial to first time home buyers? I would say yes. Does it kind of solve the issue? No. Like, there's still lots of fundamental problems at play.
Yeah, that's something I've been talking about quite a bit the last 2 years, is that there's a monetary side to supply and demand as well. And when you just try to make housing affordable by shoveling more money at people, everyone just bids up the price of homes further. I mean, it doesn't actually affect the real asset supply and demand side.
Yeah, well, that's kind of part of it too, right? Is you can unfortunately see that discount absorbed by the sellers, where all of a sudden, if demand, bumps up whatever percentage point because of this GST cut, that pushes prices higher, and eventually the net gain, the buyers are suddenly just facing higher prices anyway, versus lower prices with GST. So it's, again, it's kind of the unintended consequences that you have to be aware of with those kind of things.
Yeah. And, I do think getting rid of the GST on new build homes is kind of a step in the right direction in terms of taking the GST off of an essential good that we need to be built. Yeah. But I think it's another one of those issues that highlights the need for all levels of government to be pulling in the same direction, right? Because when interest rates were falling and everybody was making tons of money in housing, we got into a situation where there were a lot of people on the public and private side, like federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments, speculators, lenders, realtors, mortgage brokers. Everybody was basically getting a slice of new home construction. And, for a long time, that was fine because the home buyers were still seeing their equity increase almost immediately after purchase. So it didn't feel like you were losing money or paying a lot for those costs. But now that we're in more of a crunch and the market is moving back to, let's say, fundamentals between prices and incomes and rents, we probably need to have fewer people extracting a profit between the builder and the end user.
Yeah, and that's kind of it as well. And you can talk about the policies around, you know, like I think again, it does incentivize the first time home buyer, doesn't, which is the objective is trying to make it easier for lower income families and the like to enter the market. But again, it's the unintended consequences, and real estate is one of Canada's most important industries in terms of the middlemen that we have benefit from it. It's a big contributor to our gross domestic product is just the sale process of real estate, which is tricky, right? Once you're dependent on it,
Yeah.
you have to be careful with reducing it. And I think that's almost what kind of the last few years have been really tricky for the Liberal Party is there's almost kind of this dual benefit you have to promise of we're not going to crash the economy by crashing home prices, but we're also going to increase supply. It's very tricky to have both.
Yeah. And, there are lots of people who come to rely on it. Like we've seen both I think actually the Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP promised to cut municipal development charges in half and basically reimburse municipalities for the lost revenue through federal
Yeah,
borrowing,
like a cost
essentially.
sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, the issue with that is that you're almost rewarding cities that have become overly reliant on a hot real estate market to fund their city projects. And you're kind of punishing cities that have taken a more responsible approach and said, okay, we're not just going to try and grab money out of development charges. We're going to try and do something more sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point in terms of yeah, it definitely gives them the bigger benefit.
Yeah. So finally, I want to talk about your favorite topic, which is tariffs. Um, it's honestly kind of a boring topic for me because we don't have that much control over it, and it
Sure.
changes so fast that whatever you say tends to be out of date by the time the video comes out.
Yeah.
Which I
Yeah.
noticed that with your last video on it, it was
Oh my
I
God.
saw
Yeah.
it
It was like within
something like
minutes.
yeah, it was like 9 hours after it was posted, and it was already like there had been a big change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but my question for you is because this is so unpredictable, what are some things you think people can do individually to help shield themselves from the effect of tariffs?
It's it's tough because outside of just the obvious things of substitution and things like that, to your point, similar to how we can't control it from a policy standpoint, we don't have much control at the consumer level. And I think that's what's kind of the biggest danger with all this is ultimately consumers are the ones who pick up the buck and have to deal with the consequences of it. At the individual level, it's tough. It's about finding new sources of stuff. Like the biggest hit or a big area we'll see hit is small businesses that are reliant on trade for their operations. And, finding new partners is difficult and tricky to do on such a short-term notice. I think kind of one of the biggest criticisms of on the US side, the tariff implementation has been how drastic and quick it was. We went from effectively a free trade agreement to 25% tariffs on certain areas within a matter of months with very little negotiation beforehand, if none. In terms of advice for individuals, it's tough to say, kind of the thing that would be great to say in hindsight is obviously having things like a rainy day, like, financial advice wise, it would always fall on things like rainy day funds, putting aside 3 to 6 months of salary. But, in the moment, it's tough to say what you can do to circumvent that. The benefit or, kind of at the macro level, the one silver lining to all this is I think we talk a lot about how you have to get onboarding and get everyone rowing in the same direction. Nothing does that better than a common enemy. And really with the tariffs, we've seen things like the discussion of taking down interprovincial trade barriers. Even things like the discussions around pipelines have really warmed up in Canada, where we've seen a lot more leniency towards the idea of pipelines within Canada. Now, whether we'll get any built is tough to say, but the fact is our East Coast imports oil and our west side of the country makes it. And within that as well, we also have not too much refining capacity for our own oil. So oil usually goes below the border and then comes back up to actually meet our needs. in a way, there is sort of the silver lining that Canada has the kick in the butt to address some of these issues. Provinces have the kick in the butt to lower their barriers and collaborate and work together and row in that same direction. But on the individual level, it's tough. There's the truth is that if things are sustained, it's going to be a turbulent kind of time, and we'll have to deal with the consequences of that.
Yeah, it's a good point that it'll potentially help to spur a little more domestic production, domestic industry, and maybe finally get rid of some of our interprovincial trade barriers. I think, what I try to tell people at the individual level is to do almost the same thing, is try to build up your own community of people around you to be a little more robust and provide for some of each other's needs. Like if you help your friend fix a car or build a fence or look after their kids or something, just as like a favor between the people in the community, you can't tax it, you can't tariff it, you absorb all the value of that service within your own community. So, maybe the best investment is the friends we made along the way.
That's right. Yeah, just the benefit of the tariff war is the friends made along the way. That's right.
Okay, so my final question before we wrap up. In your professional opinion, as a portfolio manager, who should everyone vote for?
Oh man. You know what? I'm going to abstain from that. So I was saying before this, I often shy away from discussing policy because of the political implications, but hopefully the discussion is, allows people to think more about the financial implications of the election. And what's important to highlight is there are many other implications. There's climate change implications. There's tariff policy implications. There's all defense implications and stuff from either policy, civil rights and things of that sort. So lots of other areas, but kind of with our discussion, the hope is to focus on the area that you know way more about housing than I do, and I come from a finance background. So focus on the areas that we have some comfort and expertise on, while also listening to the conversations from professionals on the other topics so that you become well informed on the election. So my advice, my tip, outside of who to vote for, is to be informed, to listen to those conversations, get that research, do that, look into the policies and the like. What I will say is kind of on the areas we've talked about, there's nothing that dramatically is different between the parties. In real estate, we have kind of the Liberals with this new entity that will be Plain Developer. But there's nothing that's, say, a big swing one way or the other. We kind of see these smaller policies that are playing a role. So I think that makes it even more important to look into the other areas as well. So that's the answer I'll give on that one.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on your point there, I think there is a big benefit to discussing policies in a sort of politically neutral way, right? Which is that policies are not restricted to whatever party first proposed them in the election, right?
Yeah,
I think
as we've seen,
there's
like
good policies and bad policies in every platform, and if we have a better, individual understanding of each policy, then we can still advocate for that policy. You don't have to hate a policy just because it came from the party that you voted against. We should be pulling for good policies from whoever ultimately is elected, and I think that's the approach I try to push in my videos.
Yeah, and kind of the other consideration too is while the leader naturally matters as well, with party elections, you also do have to consider your member of parliament, like your local representative and who you're voting for there. Ultimately the party in power benefits from adding people of a high caliber and quality to the party. So, that's a consideration as well as if you're, say, on the fence about which party you want in terms of their policies, certainly consider your member of parliament, consider who you're voting for at the local level.
Well said. All right, well, that's all I had for this interview. So thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I also really appreciate you giving me kind of the initial shout out in your housing crisis video that gave me a boost and got me to take YouTube a little more seriously.
Of course. Yeah, no, I loved this series. It was, it was almost a bit of an inspiration too, is to talk more about the topic was, to talk about Canadian housing and this stuff. Cause I think your content did a really good job of highlighting the absurdity of it, especially too, I'm sure I wouldn't know your breakdown, but I'm sure even for viewers outside of Canada, kind of introducing them to this bizarre situation. Mm-hmm. So no, it was absolutely, I'm very happy to highlight quality content in the space.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moron for for the help today, for the chat today. Sorry.
See ya.
Cheers.